Welcome back to XRP On Moon, the channel where we dive deep into the most intense, controversial, and fast-moving developments around XRP and the future of digital finance. If you are new here, you are stepping into a space where nothing is taken at face value, and every signal in the market, every whisper in the system, and every hidden connection behind the scenes is carefully examined. Now, today's topic is something that has been circulating across crypto circles, private discussions, and underground financial forums with growing intensity. It revolves around a shocking claim that something just happened involving former CIA members and XRP. At first glance, it sounds like another exaggerated crypto rumor designed to grab attention. But when you start connecting the dots, the narrative becomes far more complex, far more strategic, and far more unsettling for those who follow global financial shifts closely. Before we go deeper, let's set the stage properly. XRP has never been just another cryptocurrency. From its early days, it has been surrounded by institutional attention, regulatory pressure, and global financial speculation. Unlike most digital assets that operate purely in retail-driven cycles, XRP has always been tied, at least in perception, to banking systems, cross-border liquidity solutions, and high-level financial experimentation. This alone makes it a magnet for theories involving intelligence networks, government-linked financial restructuring, and covert technological adoption. Now, the recent wave of discussion centers around alleged interactions or involvement of individuals formerly associated with intelligence operations, specifically ex-CIA personnel, and how their post-agency roles may intersect with blockchain infrastructure projects. To be clear, nothing officially confirmed exists that directly ties XRP to any intelligence agency. However, what fuels the speculation is the pattern of how intelligence professionals often transition into cybersecurity firms, financial intelligence platforms, and emerging technology advisory roles after leaving service. In this environment, XRP becomes a focal point of curiosity because of its positioning in global liquidity infrastructure. The idea being discussed is not that XRP is controlled by any agency, but rather that individuals with deep intelligence backgrounds may be observing, advising, or even participating indirectly in systems that could benefit from blockchain-based settlement technology. And when people in crypto hear phrases like ex-CIA involvement, it instantly triggers theories about hidden coordination, strategic financial planning, and long-term control mechanisms. What makes this situation more interesting is the timing. Over the past period, XRP has seen renewed attention from institutional circles, increased clarity in regulatory discussions, and shifting sentiment around its long-term utility. Whenever a digital asset enters such a phase of transformation, speculation naturally intensifies. People begin to ask, who is really behind the adoption wave? Is it purely market demand, or is there a deeper layer of strategic integration happening behind closed doors? This is where the narrative around ex-intelligence professionals becomes powerful. Intelligence agencies deal with data, systems, surveillance, and global networks of information flow. Blockchain technology, on the other hand, represents transparent yet complex data movement across borders without traditional friction. The overlap between these two domains, information control and decentralized settlement, creates a conceptual bridge that fuels speculation. In crypto communities, especially those focused on XRP, this bridge often becomes a storytelling framework. It suggests that XRP's role in global finance may be too significant to be left entirely to market forces alone. Instead, some believe it sits at the intersection of institutional finance, regulatory evolution, and strategic global liquidity planning, where various actors, including former intelligence professionals now operating in private sectors, could have interest in shaping or observing its trajectory. As this discussion grows, it is important to separate confirmed facts from narrative expansion. There is no verified evidence of any direct operational link between XRP and CIA structures. However, what cannot be ignored is the growing sophistication of participants in the blockchain ecosystem. Former government analysts, cybersecurity experts, financial strategists, and intelligence-adjacent professionals increasingly enter the crypto space as advisors, researchers, and consultants. And that is where today's story truly begins. Because whether these connections are direct, indirect, or purely speculative, the perception alone is powerful enough to influence sentiment, fuel debate, and create waves of attention across XRP communities worldwide. The sudden surge of discussion around alleged ex-CIA involvement and XRP did not appear out of nowhere. It started quietly, almost unnoticed, in small corners of crypto forums and private discussion groups where analysts, traders, and researchers often share fragmented pieces of information. At first, it was just a passing mention, an observation that a few former intelligence-linked professionals had been appearing in fintech advisory roles connected to blockchain infrastructure companies. But as often happens in the crypto space, isolated observations began to merge into a larger narrative. The turning point came when certain online discussions started connecting these professional transitions with broader global financial developments. XRP, already a highly debated digital asset due to its legal battles, banking partnerships, and cross-border payment utility, naturally became part of that conversation. People began asking whether its role in global liquidity systems could attract attention from individuals with intelligence backgrounds, especially those trained in monitoring financial systems, geopolitical risk, and technological disruption. As these discussions evolved, the narrative shifted from simple curiosity to speculation about intent. Some argued that if individuals formerly associated with intelligence agencies are now working in blockchain-related sectors, it could indicate a strategic awareness of where global finance is heading. Others pushed back strongly, stating that this is a natural career transition for cybersecurity and data experts who simply move into private industry after government service. But in crypto culture, especially around XRP, ambiguity tends to amplify rather than reduce speculation. Another key factor fueling this story was the increasing institutional attention toward digital assets like XRP. Whenever major financial institutions, regulatory bodies, or cross-border payment networks show renewed interest in a technology, it creates space for theories about deeper coordination. XRP's design for liquidity transfer and settlement efficiency makes it particularly attractive in discussions about future financial infrastructure. This alone is enough to spark imagination about who might be observing or influencing its evolution from behind the scenes. During this period, some posts began circulating claims that certain advisory figures linked to blockchain projects had backgrounds in intelligence analysis or national security consulting. While this is not unusual in the tech and cybersecurity world, the crypto community often interprets such backgrounds through a more dramatic lens. Instead of seeing it as professional expertise, it gets framed as hidden influence or strategic oversight. This is where XRP becomes a central point of convergence. Because unlike many cryptocurrencies driven primarily by retail hype, XRP has always existed in a more complex narrative space, tied to banking infrastructure discussions, regulatory scrutiny, and enterprise-level adoption theories. So when any mention of intelligence-adjacent professionals enters the conversation, it naturally attaches itself to XRP faster than to most other assets. What further intensified the discussion was the timing of broader geopolitical and financial uncertainty. In periods where global markets are shifting, narratives about control, surveillance, and financial restructuring tend to gain traction. Crypto communities, already sensitive to themes of decentralization versus institutional control, often interpret these developments through a lens of hidden strategy rather than coincidence. However, it is important to understand how information evolves in such environments. A single observation about a professional background can quickly transform into a theory about coordinated involvement. From there, each new unrelated event in the market gets interpreted as supporting evidence, even when no direct connection exists. This is how narratives grow in the crypto space. Not always from facts, but from layered interpretation of coincidences, timing, and perception. In the case of XRP, this process is even more amplified because of its history. Years of regulatory battles, media attention, and speculation about institutional adoption have already created a psychological framework where people expect large hidden forces to be involved. So when the phrase ex-CIA members enters the conversation, it does not land in isolation, it lands on top of years of existing narrative buildup. As a result, what began as scattered comments evolved into a trending discussion point. Could there be deeper strategic awareness or indirect involvement from intelligence background professionals in shaping the ecosystem where XRP operates? While no concrete evidence supports direct involvement, the conversation itself reflects something important about the current state of crypto markets, the blending of finance, technology, geopolitics, and perception into a single interconnected narrative space. The discussion around X-intelligence backgrounds in XRP continued to spread. The narrative started shifting from who might be involved to a deeper and more complex question: why XRP specifically keeps getting pulled into these kinds of theories more than other digital assets. This is where the conversation becomes less about individuals and more about perception, structure, and the unique position XRP holds in the broader financial ecosystem. To understand this, you have to look at how XRP is fundamentally viewed in the crypto space. Unlike many cryptocurrencies that are primarily driven by decentralized community culture or speculative trading cycles, XRP has always been surrounded by an institutional identity. From its early positioning as a bridge currency for cross-border payments to its association with enterprise-level financial solutions, XRP has been framed, rightly or wrongly, as a digital asset with ties to traditional financial infrastructure. This perception alone creates a psychological foundation where people naturally assume higher levels of strategic involvement. When an asset is seen as potentially integrated into banking systems or global liquidity networks, it stops being viewed as just a market-driven token and starts being interpreted as part of a larger financial architecture. In that environment, any mention of government, regulatory bodies, or intelligence-related professionals instantly gains amplified meaning. The role of former intelligence personnel in this narrative is particularly interesting. In reality, individuals with backgrounds in agencies like the CIA often move into sectors such as cybersecurity, risk analysis, data intelligence, and private consulting. These are fields that overlap heavily with modern financial technology. Blockchain systems, digital identity frameworks, and cross-border data flow analysis all require expertise that former intelligence analysts often possess. So their presence in the industry is not unusual, but in the crypto world, it is often interpreted through a more dramatic lens. This is where XRP becomes a magnet for speculation. Because it is already associated with high-level financial discussions, people tend to assume that anyone with a strategic or intelligence background entering the blockchain space might naturally gravitate towards systems like XRP, not because of confirmed involvement, but because of perceived relevance. This subtle difference between relevance and involvement is what fuels most of the narrative tension. At the same time, global financial transformation is adding fuel to these discussions. The world is moving toward faster settlement systems, digital payment rails, and more integrated financial networks. In such an environment, technologies like XRP are often discussed in the context of efficiency, liquidity bridging, and institutional adoption. Whenever financial systems evolve, speculation about coordination, oversight, and strategic planning tends to rise alongside it. Crypto communities interpret this shift in very different ways. Some see XRP as a natural evolution of payment infrastructure that will eventually integrate with global banking systems. Others view it as a contested space where multiple forces, regulators, institutions, technology developers, and possibly even intelligence-linked advisors could be indirectly shaping its trajectory. Neither perspective is fully confirmed, but both contribute to the intensity of the conversation. What makes this even more complex is how information spreads in the digital era. A single claim or observation can quickly travel across platforms, be reinterpreted, expanded, and transformed into a larger narrative without any central verification point. By the time it reaches mainstream discussion, it often carries layers of interpretation that go far beyond the original statement. This is exactly how the idea of ex-CIA involvement in XRP discussions has evolved, less as a factual claim and more as a narrative construct built from multiple fragmented observations. Another key factor is the emotional environment of the crypto market itself. XRP holders, like many in the digital asset space, have experienced long periods of uncertainty, legal challenges, and market volatility. In such conditions, narratives that suggest hidden strength, institutional alignment, or strategic backing often gain more traction because they provide a sense of structure in an otherwise unpredictable environment. So when people hear terms like intelligence background, strategic advisory, or government-linked expertise, they subconsciously connect it with the idea of big forces potentially shaping XRP's future. This does not confirm any actual involvement, but it explains why such narratives spread so quickly and persistently. Ultimately, what is unfolding here is less about confirmed connections and more about perception layers stacking on top of one another. XRP's identity as a bridge between traditional finance and blockchain technology makes it a natural focal point for complex theories involving institutions, regulation, and high-level expertise. This discussion focuses less on speculation and more on market psychology and perception impact, because regardless of whether any claims about ex-intelligence professionals have merit, the way such narratives circulate around XRP has real effects on how people interpret the asset. In financial markets, especially crypto, perception often moves faster than verified information. When a narrative like high-level institutional or intelligence-adjacent involvement starts circulating, it does not need confirmation to influence behavior. traders, retail investors, and even analysts begin to reevaluate the asset through a different lens. XRP, already positioned in a unique regulatory and institutional narrative space, becomes even more sensitive to these shifts in perception. One of the key effects is increased speculative attention. When people believe an asset might be connected, directly or indirectly, to powerful institutional actors or strategic global systems, they tend to assign it higher long-term significance. This does not necessarily translate into immediate price movement, but it does increase engagement, discussion volume, and liquidity interest during key market phases. Another important impact is narrative-driven volatility and sentiment. XRP has historically experienced cycles where external news, regulatory developments, and community-driven theories significantly affect short-term sentiment. When intelligence-related speculation enters the conversation, it adds a layer of perceived geopolitical complexity. That complexity often leads to divided opinions. Some participants become more confident in long-term potential, while others become more cautious due to uncertainty about hidden influences. From a behavioral finance perspective, this is a classic case of information ambiguity amplifying emotional interpretation. When facts are limited but narratives are strong, the human mind tends to fill gaps with assumptions. In XRP's case, its existing association with banking systems and cross-border finance makes it more vulnerable to these interpretive gaps than many other digital assets. At the institutional level, however, the reality is more grounded. Financial institutions, regulatory bodies, and technology firms are primarily focused on efficiency, compliance, scalability, and interoperability. If former intelligence professionals are involved in blockchain-related sectors, their role is most likely in areas such as cybersecurity, data protection, risk modeling, or infrastructure analysis, not direct influence over any specific cryptocurrency's direction. These roles are functional, not controlling. However, perception in retail markets does not always align with operational reality. In crypto ecosystems, especially around assets like XRP, narrative framing often becomes as influential as technical fundamentals. This is because many participants are not only evaluating technology, they are also evaluating potential future scenarios involving global finance transformation. Another factor to consider is how XRP sits at the intersection of regulatory visibility and institutional experimentation. Unlike purely decentralized assets that operate outside traditional frameworks, XRP is frequently discussed in contexts involving compliance, banking integration, and cross-border liquidity systems. This makes it a natural target for broader systemic theories, even when those theories extend beyond verified data. As a result, any mention of high-level strategic professionals, whether from intelligence, finance, or government-adjacent backgrounds, tends to be interpreted as potentially meaningful, even when it is simply a reflection of career transitions into private sector technology roles. What emerges from all of this is not evidence of control or coordination, but rather a highly sensitive narrative environment where XRP consistently becomes a reference point for discussions about the future structure of global finance. This sensitivity amplifies every rumor, observation, or speculative link, turning them into wider conversations across the crypto space. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it explains why XRP continues to attract such unusual narratives. It is not necessarily about hidden involvement, it is about its position as a symbol within a rapidly evolving financial system where technology, regulation, and global capital flows are deeply interconnected. It's important to bring the discussion back to ground reality versus speculation because narratives like ex-CIA involvement around XRP tend to grow in intensity online, but they often drift far from verifiable facts. First, there is no confirmed evidence that XRP is controlled, directed, or influenced by any intelligence agency or former CIA operational structure. What exists instead is a broader and very normal pattern seen across many industries. Professionals with government, intelligence, cybersecurity, or defense backgrounds transitioning into the private sector. This happens in finance, technology, and cybersecurity globally because their skill sets, data analysis, risk assessment, threat modeling, and systems architecture are highly valuable in modern digital infrastructure. When these professionals enter blockchain or fintech-related companies, their involvement is typically technical or advisory, not strategic control over specific cryptocurrencies. The crypto space, however, tends to interpret these overlaps in a much more dramatic way, especially when the asset in question already carries strong institutional associations like XRP. Second, XRP's real-world relevance does not depend on hidden involvement theories. Its value proposition is tied to cross-border payments, liquidity efficiency, and financial settlement infrastructure discussions. Whether or not one believes in long-term adoption, the core focus remains on regulatory clarity, institutional integration, and real-world utility adoption, not secret coordination narratives. Third, the persistence of these kinds of theories says more about market psychology than market structure. In highly speculative environments like crypto, participants constantly search for signals that explain long-term direction. When information is incomplete or complex, the mind naturally fills gaps with narratives involving powerful actors, hidden systems, or strategic oversight. XRP, due to its unique history with regulators and financial institutions, becomes a frequent canvas for these interpretations. However, for serious analysis, it is crucial to separate three things: facts, possibilities, and speculation. Facts are what is publicly verifiable. Possibilities are what could happen based on industry trends. Speculation is what is imagined without evidence. The ex-CIA XRP connection narrative currently sits firmly in the speculation category. What actually matters going forward for XRP is far more concrete. Market participants should focus on regulatory developments, institutional adoption progress, liquidity network expansion, and technological integration within global payment systems. These are the factors that historically influence long-term positioning in financial markets. If XRP continues to evolve within regulated financial ecosystems, its future will be shaped by partnerships, compliance frameworks, and real utility, not by hidden intelligence-linked coordination theories. And if it does not achieve that level of integration, then no narrative, no matter how compelling, will change the fundamental outcome. The discussion around ex-CIA involvement reflects the emotional and speculative nature of crypto communities rather than verified structural reality. XRP remains an asset whose future is being defined in real time by regulation, adoption, and global financial transformation, not secret affiliations. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. Cryptocurrency markets are highly volatile and risky. Always conduct your own research and consult a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decisions.